We're grateful to be together today. I'm grateful to celebrate mothers today, in addition to our time studying from the Word of God and worshiping Him. What would we like to include in our prayer this morning? Yes, Alan.
My next door neighbor, May Shimfessel, she passed away. I remember her family.
Okay. So we've been praying for Alan's neighbor, May Shimfessel, and she did pass away recently, so we want to pray for her family. Yes, Sid.
Bobby Slatton family, Slatton, from Georgia, they're part of our archery crew. His daughter was in California, and she's gone missing. She's been missing for a couple of weeks. They thought it was going to be just a quick round her up because got lost. So the Slatton family.
Okay.
And the loss of his daughter was missing.
Right, so this is the Slatton family that the Wells know through archery. The daughter has gone missing out of state. So I want to pray for that family, the Slatton family. Others this morning? Yes, sir. Okay. Had to replace the floor. Like you didn't say, you didn't say she hit her head on the floor. Okay. So I want to pray for Billy recovering from a fall this past week. Billy Watson. Kathy Thorpe is recovering from heart cath and multiple stent placement this past week. She's here today. We're grateful for that. We hope she sees some increased energy and less labored breathing with that. Frank Anderson is at home today with shingles. I messaged him yesterday, and he said that there has been some pain. The shingles are on his forehead. There has been some pain, but that he thinks it's not going to go into his eye. That was a concern. So they seem to think that it's not going to spread anymore. So he's working on that at home. He did have the vaccine, and hopefully that means the recovery time will be shorter. So Frank's not here today, and Russell Rogers is out of town today. So our shepherds are not able to be among us. Any other requests this morning? Thanksgivings? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Nelda.
I was going to say my sister got good news. They said she didn't have to have any more chemo or radiation or anything, but
This is Laura. Laura
that was a good thing.
Laura Ford, Nelda's sister, who's been dealing with cancer, got good news recently. She does not need any more treatment right now. So we're grateful for good news always. Yes, Henry.
Prayer of thankfulness, Mother's Day.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
For our mother, we wouldn't be here.
Indeed. Henry says, a prayer of thanksgiving for our mothers, without whom we would not be here. Okay, Alan's going to lead us in prayer.
Bow with me as we go before the Lord in prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for this Lord's Day. We thank you for the privilege we have of gathering in your house to praise you and worship you in song, word, and action. And we ask for your guidance, Father, so that we may honor you and that we may worship you in spirit and in truth.
All right, if you'd like to open up, we're going to be in Revelation 17 and 18 this morning. Revelation 17 and 18. We'll do a little bit of review before we look more closely at those two chapters. Of course, the assumption is that all who were regular attendees of the class have read ahead because we cannot possibly cover everything in the class period. Let's do a little bit of review. You've probably grown tired of this question, but what's the book of Revelation about? Jesus. Well, don't be so excited about it. What's the book of Revelation about? Jesus. Yes, we are so grateful, aren't we? All of the details, all of the scenery, all of the questions we have when we study the book of Revelation, all of that pales in comparison to what's clear, the victory and the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. A few details. We haven't looked at these in several weeks, but this review this morning is to help us in particular as we think about some of the themes that come up in chapters 17 and 18. In particular, we've keyed in on the audience and their context. So remember those 7 letters that we talked about early in the class period, second class. The 7 letters to the churches in Asia Minor, and I know that's a little bit difficult to read, but you'll notice in particular, I'm going to turn around so I can use the pointer. Hopefully I'm not standing in anyone's way. I'm going to sit down. You can hear me. You'll notice that all of these letters have common elements, and among those, the bottom 3 in the left-hand column, a criticism and condemnation, with the exception of Smyrna and Philadelphia, who are the 2 faithful churches. A call to repentance also that is missing because they're faithful. An exhortation to hear and a promise that's given to the faithful. Now, all of this is in the context of what? What are these churches all dealing with according to the letters that we read at the very beginning of this class? Persecution. Temptation. And what are the 2 key sins, if you will, that are tied to this persecution and this temptation? They both start with I, if that helps you remember them at all. Idolatry in the form of primarily emperor worship in Asia Minor, although there are other pagan deities that are worshipped. And what's the other one? Immorality. And that immorality is often tied to the idolatry, and it can be sexual in nature, but not necessarily so. So we said in that class period, this slide is taken from that class. The criticisms of the churches often relate to practicing some form of idolatry and or sexual immorality. And something that's common throughout the book is that what is described is often described in Old Testament language. All right, so here's where we are. You've seen this slide many times now. There are 6 major scenes of celebratory worship that bookend 6 visions that overlap each other in the book of Revelation. And we are now on number 5, the 7 plagues or the 7 bowls that are poured out. And I mentioned last week the numbering of these can be a little bit artificial. But why is it that through chapter 19 we have this? Well, 19, 1 through 10 is one of these major scenes of celebratory worship. But we said, where does the 7th bowl stop? Because last week we talked about chapters 15 and 16, and the 7th bowl is poured out at the end of chapter 16. And we said, where does the 7th bowl stop? And what we see is that there is a connection between Babylon the Great, as appears in 16:19, and the chapters that hopefully you were able to read this past week, 17 and 18, that are all about Babylon the Great. And so that's why some people see that basically 17 and 18 is a further expansion of the 7th bowl that appears at the end of chapter 16. I hope that makes sense to everyone. There's definitely a thematic connection there, okay? So, as we have done throughout this class, especially as we've gotten further into it, I'm giving you an opportunity to tell me what you recognize. I do have some items that are going to show up on the screen, but I want to give you the opportunity first to talk about anything you recognize first in chapter 17. And then after we discuss chapter 17, we'll go into chapter 18. Anything that stood out to you, anything that you said, oh, I've seen this before in chapter 17?
Well, the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns.
The beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. All right. That's the first item on my list too, so I'll go ahead and put that on the screen. So where does the beast appear? Well, in chapter 12, we're first introduced to this beast. He rises up, a dragon he's called, 7 heads and 10 horns. We've talked about the significance of these symbolic numbers. So 7 being what? Complete or perfect, the combination of heaven and earth. 10 being a total set, okay? And so we said 7 heads, representative of wisdom or false wisdom, knowledge. And the 10 horns being representative of power, authority, okay? And so this beast we have seen before. All right? And in chapter 12, the beast is identified as the ancient serpent, right? Yeah, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, okay? And so appears again in chapter 13. All right, what about Babylon? Well, let me back up. I'm getting ahead of you guys. What did you recognize? I just gave you a hint. What did you recognize? It doesn't have to be what I just put on the screen.
We have seen Babylon before, mentioned.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and talk about it, and then I'll give you guys an opportunity since I already flashed that up there. What about Babylon? What do you know about Babylon? In general, not just in the book of Revelation. What do you know about Babylon in the Old Testament?
Well, it's a very powerful empire.
Very powerful empire. Where does Babylon really come into our radar, into our realm of thinking in the Old Testament? Okay, so Babylon is the nation that conquers the southern kingdom of Judah. So you recall very quickly, in brief terms, that following David and Solomon, in the days of Solomon's son, Rehoboam, kingdom divides. From that point forward, 2 separate kingdoms. There's quite a bit of interaction, but 2 separate monarchies. Southern kingdom, all descendants of David. Northern kingdom, no descendants of David. Northern kingdom, wholly given over to idolatry, through and throughout. The Bible never says anything positive on the whole, never gives a totally positive view of any of the kings in the northern kingdom. In the southern kingdom, it sort of goes every 2nd or 3rd generation, you'll have a good guy, okay? But eventually the northern kingdom is taken by the Assyrians. The capital of Assyria is Nineveh. So that puts some context for the book of Jonah. Southern kingdom is taken some years later by Babylon. Babylon comes to the southern kingdom 3 different times, and ultimately they carry off almost all the people, including the nobles, any people of promise. And what do to the city of Jerusalem? They destroy it. They break down the wall. But then there's something especially egregious, especially terrible that happens in this process.
Well, they take all the valuables from the temple.
And then do what to it?
They melt them down.
They destroy the temple. They tear the temple down. They burn it. They take it all the way down to the foundation. There's nothing left. So God's people go into captivity in Babylon, and Babylon has destroyed the temple of God. Now, later in the history of the Old Testament, God's people come back. They're going to build another temple, but it sort of pales in comparison. The central image of the worship of the one true God among the people whom He has chosen is destroyed by Babylon. So that becomes a really important image and thought in the minds of God's people forever. And that it forms the basis of the use of Babylon as an image in the book of Revelation. So what does Babylon represent? Babylon represents great power. Babylon represents great power used to harm God's people. Babylon represents also great immorality. So Babylon, one of these 7 wonders of the world, in the ancient world, lots of people coming in and out, lots of people practicing all kinds of idolatry and immorality. Of course, we can get some of this from Daniel, but it's a close parallel, chapter 17 and 18, close parallel. I highly recommend you go read Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah living through this period of the destruction of Jerusalem. He's one of the few who remains behind after the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem. He ends up being sent down to Egypt against his will. But Jeremiah 51, a prophecy against Babylon. Okay. There's a lot more that could be said, but for the sake of time, perhaps we need to continue. What else did you notice in your study of chapter 17? Any imagery, any themes that you've seen before?
Well, she was seated on many waters.
She was seated on many waters?
We've seen quite a bit about water.
Yes. So that's verse 1. She's seated on many waters. We've said that in this ancient literature, water often represents chaos. But does the text of chapter 17 tell us what the many waters actually are?
The angel explains the vision, but I don't remember what.
Okay. And I've lost place because I know that the text does say.
Verse 15.
Verse 15, thank you. The waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. So that's another thing that we've talked about is we want to take very seriously the places where images and themes in the book are actually interpreted within the book itself. And you'll notice that the angel tells John about her, I'm going to tell you the mystery of this woman, verse 7. And then actually he tells us more the mystery of the beast in this case than he does the woman, doesn't he? So very little about the woman is actually described, but there's a very close connection between the beast and the woman. So how is the beast and the woman described? There in the central section of chapter 17. How is the beast and the woman described and explained there in the central paragraph in chapter 17? This is a paragraph beginning at the end of verse 6 and going through verse 14. So he says, the beast you saw is about to rise. Okay. This calls for a mind of wisdom, verse 9. The 7 heads are 7 mountains or hills on which the woman is seated. Anybody familiar with that language? Anybody ever been to Cincinnati, Ohio? Have you ever seen a sign driving into Cincinnati that says the city of 7 hills? You ever seen that? There are actually many, many cities in the modern world that claim to have been built on 7 hills. There's a city in Mexico. There's actually several cities in the United States of America, and there's cities in other places in the world. But the original city of 7 hills, Rome. Okay? Rome. And so it seems to be that if we remember our context, we go back to the original audience, how would the readers, hearers of Revelation initially have taken a reference to 7 mountains or 7 hills? There's no way they didn't know that this was a reference to Rome. Okay. Now, we can try to work out all the details of the kings, the one who is and is not and is to come and all of these things, but the general picture is pretty clear for the original audience. So we've got something to do with Rome. And I think chapter 18 actually is going to make that even clearer for us because of the way that this is described. But something I also want you to notice is that sometimes Revelation is viewed as a code. You know, you ever do one of those little puzzles in the newspaper where every letter has a representative number? And if you can figure out what letter is assigned to what number, you can spell out the sentence. You know, everybody know what I'm talking about? Anybody unfamiliar with that? Or, you know, I think some have seen like the Christmas movie with Ralphie, and he's trying to decode the message, right? Okay, so what is a code? A code is a one-to-one correspondence. This thing represents this other thing. And if you have the key, you can get the whole picture. Okay? And a lot of people read Revelation like a code, and they think that every single image you should be able to take it, and if you've got the key, you can break down the code. But Revelation is not a code. Imagery is not the same thing as a code. And so I think it's one way that we can see that is when it starts talking about these kings, and it says that there are these 10 kings, and there's one who belongs to the 8, but he's not of the 8, and all these other things. Nobody has ever been able to fit any kingdom, any succession of kings, one-to-one into that image. The point of that is more generic than to specifically say it's this and it's this. And so it says 5 of whom has fallen, one is, the other is yet to come. When he comes, he must remain only a little while. This is about this instability that's coming. And okay, so the point of that being that we can get a general idea of it, but an attempt to break it down into a one-to-one correspondence with anything in history has failed over and over again. And doing so is ultimately going to distract us from what we can learn from the text. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, some will say, well, maybe it doesn't fit anything in history because it's in the future. But we've got to deal with the context, and the context very clearly points to Rome. And so, all right, anything else you noticed from chapter 17? We have a whole other chapter. It's a long one to go, but I don't want to shortchange anybody. Yes, Henry?
Verse 6,
Go ahead.
it said that she was drunk with God's holy people,
Uh-huh.
and with the blood of those who were killed because of their faith in Jesus.
Yes.
Holy people and have faith in Jesus is not the same.
No, it is.
I just wonder why that makes you angry.
I think it's just two ways of referring to generally the same group of people. Yeah, drunk. This says drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. So it's just two different ways of referring to the same class or group of people. So something that we see, and this is not something that I came up with, is essentially political satire. So this is something we do today. You can look in any major newspaper and you can see satire of Republicans, Democrats, the government in general, whatever. And in satire, what you have are characteristics of a group or entity that are often exaggerated. If you look at the Republicans are represented as an elephant, or the Democrats represented as a donkey, that there's exaggeration in those drawings to lampoon or make fun of those groups. Or if the person is trying to support one group over the other, the one may look ridiculous and the other one may look especially fine. You know, this is the picture of a perfect elephant or the picture of a perfect donkey. I don't know if there's such a thing as a perfect donkey. I guess there is. But that was not a political statement. That was a statement about animals. But in any case, commentators, including one of the books that I've recommended to you all, say that basically when we look at this woman, and we just read part of the description of her in verse 6, she's seated on this beast, she's got on these fine clothes and all this stuff, and she's got this cup in her hand. But inside the cup is all sort of nastiness. Basically, this is a political cartoon. That the vision that's being given to John is showing him the ridiculousness of Rome. That Rome has great power, but it's not wielding it or using it for anything good. And that's going to become clearer also when we get to chapter 18. Excuse me a moment.
It's also kind of a statement that superficially, she looks very fine and refined and lovely, but upon closer inspection, not so much.
It says that there's a superficial element to Rome, that from the outside, from the distance, she looks like this great lady. And in fact, Rome is represented in writing in the ancient world like, and Rome is not the only entity that's represented in this way, but represented like a fine lady. Even in our Old Testament, we have, in the book of Proverbs, we have Dame Folly and Lady Wisdom. And so this idea of taking and characterizing a concept or a nation or the capital city of a nation, we talk about in this country Lady Liberty, and we don't think of that as a real individual, but a representative of, we have a statue, but it's representative of this concept that we have in our country of freedom. And so Rome is represented as a lady, but that image gets distorted or shown how it is a distortion of Rome's real identity in chapter 17 and 18. This is going to be in contrast to imagery that comes up in chapter 19, where we'll go next week, because the people of God are represented as a bride. So she's a chaste woman. The people of God are a chaste virgin woman. Rome is a prostitute, the text says. And what, in the Old Testament, that imagery of sexual infidelity most often applies to idolatry. And so that's part of the key here, is the rampant idolatry in Rome, which is a problem for the Christians, is buffooned or lampooned here in chapter 17. All right, let's go to chapter 18. One of the first things you're going to notice when you read chapter 18, if you pay attention to the details, excuse me, is that the timing is all over the place. When the chapter opens, we're told Rome has fallen. Well, Babylon, the image. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, verse 2. But then when we look at verse 4, the people of God are told to come out of her. Well, if she's already been destroyed, as the chapter is going to indicate, how can you come out of her? She's already gone, right? And then in verse 9, the language indicates something as a future event. The kings of the earth who did all these things with her will weep and wail over her when they see. So something that hasn't yet happened. And then verse 11 is spoken of in the present tense. The merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, because these things are happening. And then we go back in time in verse 18. Now we're looking at the past. They cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. This is looking back on something that's already happened. And then verse 21, it's the future again, because the mighty angel says, so will Babylon the Great be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. So you look at that and you go, okay, what's going on here? The timeline's all over the place in chapter 18. What do you make of that? What do you do with that? Well, John just misunderstood the vision. That's not an adequate answer, is it? Something that we have cautioned, and we actually talked about it last week, was that if you're looking for a concrete timeline of events in Revelation, you're going to only come away confused and disappointed. And this is but one illustration of that. I want to read, because he can say it better than I can, just a couple of sentences here from Kester's book. He mentions all of these jumps in time, and he says the ever-shifting time frame may be due to the fact that John recounts a past vision of a future occurrence. So he is looking back, John is looking back, of a vision that depicts something in the future, and that's why there's a jump in time. He says, but it also shows that John's primary concern is not to detail a sequence of coming events. Rather, he writes in order to influence the way his readers live in the present, startling them into considering their current commitments in relationship to the ways of God. And so, why tell people living in Rome, the Roman Empire generally, the capital city, the source of many of the problems that you have? Look at the commerce in Asia Minor. It's tied to Rome. These relationships exist. These ports are open because of the influence of the Roman Empire. Look at the idolatry that's imported into Asia Minor, particularly the worship of the empire. All of it comes back to its hub, its basis, Rome. So you're telling people in Asia Minor, the influences around you, the idolatry, the immorality, all of it comes back to this source of great power and influence, Rome, and that is going to be defeated. And in verse 4 of chapter 18, the text says, come out of her. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? Come out of her. I'm coming to you, Lisa. I saw your hand. Do they live in Rome? I mean, the book is addressed to people in Asia Minor, right? So if Rome is the capital city, it's far, get our geography right, far west, right? Excuse me. They don't actually live in Rome, so what is verse 4 saying? Come out of her.
Quit doing the thing that she represents.
Quit participating in this stuff, right? Okay. Because is that a problem in the churches? When we read those letters, remember we reviewed the letters? Is that a problem in the churches? Are some of them participating in idolatry? Are some of them participating in sexual immorality? Are some of them getting rich, perhaps, off of the trade that's based on the power of the Roman Empire? And wealth itself is not necessarily sinful, but how you acquire it can be, right? Okay. Lisa, you had a question or a comment.
Well, 18 to me looked more like, or not more like, but it seemed like no matter where you're standing, the past, present, and future are connected. There is a connection. Even though he's jumping around, sometimes we forget that the past was important and we're affecting the future. So all of that is a connection rather than this.
I'm going to try to recap what Lisa just said. That past, present, and future affect us. Is that? Am I getting you right? Yeah. Past, present, and future affect us. So John, speaking to his readers in their moment, having some understanding of past, present, and future is going to influence their actions. Good. All right. So very briefly, with the time we have left, we're going to break down the outline of chapter 18, which is sort of like a funeral for Babylon. So verses 1 through 8 talk about the certainty of judgment on Babylon, and the reasoning that's given in verses 1 through 8 is not just her sins, but the way that she influences others to participate in this sin. Okay, and then there's that verse 4 that we just talked about, come out of her, and we said that means quit participating in her sinful stuff. Okay. Then we're shown three groups of mourners. These are people who are sad that Babylon is destroyed. Verses 9 and 10, the kings of the earth. In verses 11 through 17, the merchants. What are merchants? Yeah. People who buy and sell goods and other things. And actually, there's a list in chapter 18 of what some of those goods and items are. And some of them, you could say, well, they just represent perhaps decadence or excessive wealth, gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, etc. And then you've also got spices, you've got oil and flour and wheat and cattle, but then there's a special point that's made at the end of verse 13. Horses and chariot and slaves, that is human souls. And so human beings treated like objects by Rome. And so the merchants are weeping. Now, here's a group of people who are weeping and mourning. The kings, the merchants, the shipmasters and builders. Are they weeping for the right reason? You remember what when we look at those first two sets of judgment, 7, the seals, and then the trumpets, and you get that interlude between the 6th and the 7th item. What is God looking for in that interlude? People who will do something. Repent. And repentance is godly sorrow. It's a recognition of what I am doing is not good. It is hurting me and other people perhaps. It is against God. I'm going to turn away from that. But here we have 3 scenes of people mourning, but are they mourning over the wrong that's been done?
They're crying for themselves.
Yeah, this is not godly sorrow. This is earthly sorrow. This is mourning over a loss of opportunity to gain wealth or to participate in trade, or to participate in power and influence. So we have these shipmasters and builders, verses 17 through 20. I think that's pretty self-evident. So all of these are people who are intertwined in Rome's great power and success, politically and economically. And they're mourning over the loss of Babylon. What does 1 Timothy 6:10 say? For the love of money, not money, the love of money is what? The root of all kinds of evil. And so here you've got these people who are participating in all of this. They're complicit is the word we would use. They are guilty, along with Babylon, for all that has been done. And then we get to the end. How did the chapter start? Judgment is certain, verses 1 through 8. The chapter ends. Judgment is still certain. Doesn't matter who's weeping about this loss. Judgment is still certain. Okay, and so there's a very descriptive sense here. Babylon's going to be thrown down and found no more. There's not going to be any joy. No music. There's not going to be art. There's not going to be industry. There's not going to be weddings. There's not going to be anything. Why? Verse 24. Because Rome is persecuting the people of God. And you go back, we already saw it 17:6. She's drinking the blood of God's people. And you go all the way back to chapter 2 and verse 13. Antipas, faithful witness, is killed for the testimony of Jesus Christ. All right. So, questions, comments, or otherwise? I had to rush through it. I'd rather have time to take additional comments.
There's something comforting in knowing that, God in His patience, it can look to us like people are getting away with murder, but judgment is eventually going to come.
So Alan says there's something comforting in knowing that sometimes from our perspective, it looks like God isn't punishing the wicked, but God is going to render a righteous judgment at the appropriate time.
Some aspect, it's not the fact that they get punished, but the fact that we've been vindicated in some aspects, where we try to find a narrow, a straight and narrow, and we seem to be suffering because of it, not that we mind it, but when you see the crooked paths of others, practically rewarded. So it's almost like we've been vindicated rather
Yes.
than other people get punished.
Yeah. So the other side of that, Sid mentions, is that in that righteous judgment, there's a vindication of God's people. That is, God is not only giving a righteous or a just punishment for sin, but by those who are preserved or saved, there's a declaration of these folks have done what is right. So having followed the Lamb versus the beast. And that's something we haven't talked about in great detail. But if you pay, and we can only do so much, but if you pay attention to the way that God and the Lamb and the people of God are described in the Old Testament, in Revelation, and then you pay attention to the way that Satan and the beast and those who follow are described, it's like the great pretender. That Satan is trying to imitate the good side, but it's a facade. And Babylon that we looked at today, because there's another great city that appears in Revelation, the New Jerusalem. And so, as you mentioned, Sid, there's punishment for the wicked, there's vindication for the right. And so do you want to be part of the cheap imitation? God has a kingdom. God is powerful. God is productive. Rome, a kingdom, a human empire, powerful, productive, a tawdry imitation of the kingdom that we want to be part of, that we want to serve, the king we want to be faithful to. And that contrast is given to us in imagery throughout the book of Revelation. So what messages of hope God's people have taken? I think we've already talked about it. All the problems that you see in those 7 letters at the beginning of the book, they're going to be addressed. And this is a hope-filled message for the faithful. It's also a warning to those Christians in those churches who have been duped, who have allowed themselves to be swayed to participate in the sinfulness that's sort of coming out of the hub of Rome. Alan?
But you always have the opportunity to turn away from that and come back. There will be a final judgment. But as a Christian, you can fall away, or anybody can fall away. But you always have the opportunity.
Yeah, so God's giving an opportunity in this vision for those who aren't faithful. They see what's coming. They're reminded, hey, this is what's going to happen to the wicked. You have an opportunity to turn away and repent and be right, because you don't want the outcome of your actions.
There's also the warning that there is a time limit to that opportunity.
That's right. That's right. The time is coming. There is going to be a moment when things are final, right? Now, for us, either the Lord comes back or we die. It's appointed a man to die once and comes judgment. So either the Lord's coming back or we die. And that's it. So there is a deadline, and we don't know when that deadline is. Most of us don't know the moment we're going to die, and we definitely don't know when the Lord's coming back. And they didn't know exactly when Rome was going to fall either. So, in fact, that's not necessarily in their lifetime even. So, all right, other questions or comments? Coffee and donuts downstairs in the fellowship hall, and we'll be back for worship at 11. Thank you all.